The lighthouse beam swept across the churning Atlantic for the last time on December 15, 1900, its brilliant Fresnel lens casting salvation into the storm-black night before vanishing forever. When the relief boat finally reached Eilean Moor, 11 days later, they found something that defied every rule of lighthouse keeping. 3 experienced men had simply ceased to exist. This isn't just another maritime mystery. It's the only unsolved disappearance in the Northern Lighthouse Board's century-and-a-half history. A case so baffling that it spawned legends, ballads, and theories that persist over a century later. December 7th, 1899 marked a milestone for Scottish maritime safety. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse blazed to life for the first time, its powerful beam joining over 80 sister stations that formed an invisible net of protection around Scotland's treacherous coastline. Built on Eilean Moor, the largest of 7 remote islands locals called the Seven Hunters, this lighthouse represented the latest in Victorian engineering prowess. The tower rose 23 meters into the sky, perched on cliffs that plunged 148 feet into the roiling Atlantic. A complex system of cable railways and steam winches groaned daily, hauling 20 barrels of paraffin annually up from 2 separate landings, along with food, supplies, and the occasional bag of mail that connected these isolated men to the world beyond. 3 keepers maintained this beacon of civilization on the edge of nowhere. James Ducat, the principal keeper, commanded the station with the authority that came from years of lighthouse service. At home in Stromness, his wife and 4 children waited for his next shore leave, counting the modest but steady income, roughly £70 a year, that made Lighthouse keeping a coveted profession despite its hardships. Thomas Marshall served as second assistant, a reliable man who understood that lighthouse work demanded absolute precision. Donald McArthur held the position of occasional keeper, the rotating third man whose presence allowed the others brief respites. Their routine never varied. 4-hour watches around the clock, trimming the massive third-order Fresnel lens that could throw its light 20 miles across open water. Between shifts, they maintained the boilers that powered the fog signal, recorded weather observations in meticulous logs, and performed the endless maintenance that kept their isolated outpost operational. Sunday brought the only break mandatory prayers that reminded them of civilization's moral anchor. The work was grueling, but these weren't ordinary men. Lighthouse keepers represented an elite brotherhood, selected for their reliability, technical skill, and mental fortitude. They had to be. When winter gales hammered the Hebrides with winds that could reach hurricane force, when fog blanketed the seas for days, when supply ships couldn't reach them for weeks, these men stood as the only barrier between passing vessels and the jagged rocks that had claimed countless lives. The Flannan Isles already carried whispers of something otherworldly. Local fishermen spoke of the Phantom of the Seven Hunters, a presence that haunted these remote waters long before the lighthouse ever cast its first beam. But in December 1900, such superstitions seemed quaint compared to the solid reality of Scottish engineering and professional seamanship. The lighthouse followed ironclad protocols developed through decades of tragic experience. Never under any circumstances could all 3 keepers leave the light unattended. One man must always remain on watch, ensuring the beam continued its life-saving sweep. This rule wasn't mere bureaucracy. It was written in the graves of countless sailors who had died when lights failed. Winter storms in the North Atlantic don't ask permission. They arrive with the fury of ancient gods, hurling waves the size of buildings against anything foolish enough to stand in their path. The keepers had weathered such storms before, watching through reinforced windows as the sea tried to reclaim their rocky fortress. They knew the sound, that deep, bone-shaking boom, when massive breakers struck the cliffs below, sending spray so high that the lighthouse glass rang like a bell. But something was different about the storm that struck in mid-December 1900. On December 15th, The steamer, Arctur, noted in its log that the Flannan Isles light had gone dark during a force 9 gale. The captain marked it as unusual, but not unprecedented. Perhaps the keepers were conducting maintenance, or the storm had temporarily obscured the beam. What the Arctur's crew didn't know was that they had witnessed the last confirmed sighting of 3 men who were about to become Scotland's most enduring mystery. The relief boat Hesperus should have reached Eilean Moor on December 20th, carrying Joseph Moore, the 4th keeper who would allow the others their scheduled shore leave. But the Atlantic had other plans. Storm after storm battered the Hebrides, turning the waters around the Flannan Isles into a maelstrom that no vessel could safely navigate. For 6 days, the Hesperus waited in port while the weather raged. Captain Jim Harvey watched the barometer and knew his men were trapped on their rock, likely running low on fresh water and growing anxious for news from home. But there was nothing to do except wait for the sea to calm its fury. Have you ever wondered what it takes to make 3 experienced lighthouse keepers break the most fundamental rule of their profession? Hey, quick pause here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. It's amazing how this story connects us across time zones. If you're enjoying this mystery, hit that like button and subscribe. We've got plenty more unsolved cases coming your way. At noon on December 26, 1900, Captain Jim Harvey finally gave the order that would uncover one of maritime history's most chilling mysteries. Make ready for Eilean Moor. The Atlantic had calmed enough for the relief tender Hesperus to attempt the crossing. But 11 days of isolation meant anything could have happened on that remote rock. Those 11 days represented the longest any lighthouse in the Northern Lighthouse Board's network had gone without contact, a delay that could mean the difference between routine relief and catastrophic discovery. The Hesperus cut through slate-gray swells as Eilean Moor materialized through the morning haze. From a distance, everything appeared normal. The lighthouse tower stood proud against the winter sky, its white-painted masonry unmarked by the recent storms. The keepers' quarters nestled against the base looked intact, their slate roofs properly secured against Atlantic gales. But something felt wrong in the silence. Captain Harvey raised his brass telescope and swept it across the landing area. Standard protocol demanded that keepers display a flag when they spotted the relief vessel, signaling all was well and they were ready for the changeover. The flagpole stood empty, its halyard snapping uselessly in the wind. "Sound the whistle," Harvey ordered. The Hesperus's steam whistle shrieked across the water, 3 long blasts that should have brought the keepers running to the landing. The sound echoed off the cliffs and died. No figure appeared at the lighthouse door. No answering signal came from the station. Harvey tried again, this time firing a rocket flare that burst red against the gray sky. The brilliant explosion should have been visible from anywhere on the small island, impossible to miss or ignore. Still nothing. The lighthouse compound remained as silent as a tomb. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper waiting aboard the Hesperus, felt ice forming in his stomach. He'd made this journey dozens of times, and never, not once, had the keepers failed to respond to their arrival. Something was desperately wrong. The Hesperus maneuvered carefully toward the east landing, the safer of the 2 boat approaches in rough weather. Normally, supply crates would be waiting on the concrete platform, ready for the return journey. The platform stood empty. No ropes had been laid out for the boat. No tools or equipment cluttered the usual work areas. Moore leaped from the boat before it fully secured, his boots ringing against the wet concrete. The mechanical winch house that normally hummed with activity stood silent, its steam engine cold. The narrow-gauge railway that carried supplies up the cliff stretched empty into the mist above. "Ducat!" Moore called out, his voice cracking across the stillness. "Marshal, McArthur!" Only the wind answered, whistling through the guy wires that secured the lighthouse's aerial masts. Moore began the climb up the winding path that connected the landing to the lighthouse compound. Each step heightened his dread. These men were professionals, trained to respond immediately to any signal from the relief vessel. For all three to ignore the Hesperus meant either catastrophic illness or something far worse. The path switchbacked up the cliff face, carved into living rock by the lighthouse builders just over a year before. Normally, this climb brought anticipation news from shore, letters from family, fresh supplies after weeks of isolation. Today, it felt like ascending to a crime scene. The lighthouse door stood closed but unlocked. Moore pushed it open and called again. His voice echoed up the spiral staircase that led to the lamp room, but no reply came. The ground floor held the kitchen and common areas where the keepers took their meals and spent their off-duty hours. Everything appeared normal at first glance. Chairs sat properly around the table. Dishes rested clean on their shelves. The coal stove held cold ashes from a fire that had burned out days ago. But Moore's trained eye caught details that made his skin crawl. The dining room clock had stopped, its pendulum hanging motionless. Lighthouse keepers lived by precise schedules, meals, watches, weather observations, all timed to the minute. A stopped clock represented a fundamental breakdown in routine that no professional keeper would tolerate. The beds in the sleeping quarters told their own story. Two were unmade, blankets thrown back as if their occupants had risen hurriedly. The third bed remained properly made, suggesting one man had never retired that night. Moore found the station's logbooks and flipped to the final entries. December 15th, storm raging, wind south-southwest, force 9, heavy rain and spray, unable to trim light due to weather, seas mountainous. The handwriting was Ducat's, steady and professional despite the circumstances. But there were no entries for December 16th or any day after. 3 experienced keepers had simply stopped recording their observations, abandoning a duty as fundamental as breathing. Moore climbed to the lamp room at the tower's peak. The massive Fresnel lens sat dark and cold, its intricate prisms dusty from neglect. But here he found something that deepened the mystery. The lamps had been cleaned and refilled with fresh paraffin, ready for lighting. Someone had performed this essential maintenance, then vanished before completing their watch. In the kitchen, he discovered the keepers' oilskins hanging on their pegs. All 3 sets of weather gear remained in place, the heavy, waterproof coats that no experienced seaman would venture outside without during an Atlantic winter. Yet the men were gone. Moore's hands trembled as he checked the station's emergency supplies. The distress rockets remained in their box, unfired. The signal flags hung undisturbed in their cabinet. Whatever had taken these men, it hadn't given them time to call for help. The wind picked up, moaning through the lighthouse's iron staircase with a sound like distant voices. Moore found himself listening intently, hoping against reason to hear human footsteps or familiar voices calling from somewhere in the compound. But why would 3 seasoned professionals leave their post without a trace, abandoning the light that protected countless lives? Moore descended the lighthouse stairs with legs that barely held him, his mind reeling from the impossible scene above, when a new horror awaited at the compound's west, landing a tableau of destruction so violent it would redefine everything investigators thought they knew about the keeper's fate. The West Landing held the key to understanding how 3 men could vanish from what should have been an impregnable fortress of stone and steel. The western approach to Isle and Moore served as the lighthouse's backup landing, used only when eastern storms made the primary dock unusable. Moore had walked this path countless times during supply operations, but nothing had prepared him for what the December gales had wrought. The narrow concrete platform, normally orderly and functional, looked like a battlefield. A heavy storage box that had been bolted to the platform 33 meters above sea level lay in twisted fragments, its thick wooden planks splintered like matchsticks. Iron railings designed to withstand hurricane-force winds had been bent and twisted into grotesque sculptures of mangled metal. The very stone of the platform showed gouges where massive impacts had chipped away chunks of masonry. But the most shocking discovery lay just beyond the platform's edge. A boulder the size of a small house, engineers estimated its weight at over 1 ton, had been rolled inland from its original position near the water's edge. The groove it carved in the rock face traced its violent journey, dragged upward by forces that defied comprehension. Moore stood at the platform's edge and tried to visualize the wave that could have caused such devastation. The west landing sat over 100 feet above normal high tide. For water to reach this elevation with enough force to move a 1-ton boulder meant waves of unprecedented size, mountains of green water, driven by winds that turned the Atlantic into a cauldron of liquid destruction. The evidence continued up the cliff face. Sections of turf, 60 meters above sea level, had been torn away, ripped from the bedrock, and scattered inland for 10 meters. The spray from whatever monstrous wave had struck here had reached heights that oceanographers would later declare almost impossible, even during the most severe North Atlantic storms. Moore's lighthouse training included detailed instruction in wave mechanics and storm damage assessment. He'd seen what Atlantic gales could accomplish: boats crushed like eggshells, piers swept away, coastal structures demolished by walls of water. But this destruction spoke of forces beyond normal meteorological fury. The timeline began to crystallize in Moore's mind with horrible clarity. The storm had peaked on December 15th, the same night the Arctur had noted the light's failure. Weather records would later confirm a Force 9 westerly gale had battered the Hebrides that night, with sustained winds exceeding 70 miles per hour and gusts reaching hurricane strength. In such conditions, lighthouse protocol was crystal clear: secure all equipment, maintain the light, and never under any circumstances venture outside unnecessarily. The keeper's quarters provided shelter specifically designed to withstand the worst weather the Atlantic could deliver. So why had the men left their sanctuary? Moore examined the twisted railings more closely. The metal hadn't simply bent under pressure. It had been torqued and folded with such violence that several supports had snapped completely. He ran his fingers along the fracture points, noting the sharp edges that indicated sudden, catastrophic failure rather than gradual stress damage. A supply crane that normally stood at the platform's edge had vanished entirely. Only its concrete mounting points remained, the heavy bolts sheared off flush with the foundation. The crane's disappearance represented more than equipment loss. It eliminated one of the keeper's primary tools for handling heavy materials and emergency equipment. The wind whistled through the damaged structures with an eerie harmony, creating sounds that seemed almost like human voices calling across the water. Moore found himself glancing toward the horizon, half expecting to see figures walking across the waves toward shore. Local fishermen had always claimed the Flannan Isles held supernatural properties. They spoke of lights that appeared on nights when no keepers were scheduled, of voices heard singing across the water during calm weather, of boats that lost their way despite perfect visibility. The Phantom of the Seven Hunters. They called it a presence that predated the lighthouse by centuries. Moore had dismissed such tales as superstitious nonsense born from isolation and too much whiskey during long winter nights. Professional lighthouse keepers dealt in facts: wind speed, wave height, fuel consumption, maintenance schedules. They had no time for ghost stories. But standing amid the devastation at the West Landing, with 3 of his colleagues simply erased from existence, Moore felt the first stirrings of doubt about the rational explanations that had always anchored his world. He climbed back toward the lighthouse compound, his report already forming in his mind. Captain Harvey would need detailed documentation of the damage, precise measurements of the destruction, and most importantly, some theory about what had happened to Ducat, Marshall, and McArthur. The official investigation would focus on the physical evidence: wave heights, storm timing, structural damage assessment. But Moore carried a growing certainty that traditional maritime accident analysis might prove inadequate for explaining the Flannan Isles mystery. As he reached the lighthouse door, Moore made one final discovery that chilled him more than all the previous evidence combined. Carved into the wooden doorframe, barely visible unless viewed from the correct angle, were three sets of initials: J, D, T, M, D, M. The scratches appeared fresh, cut with a knife or sharp tool. Below them, in the same rough carving, were four words that would haunt every subsequent investigation: "We have been taken." What force could have compelled three rational men to carve what appeared to be their own epitaph? Superintendent Robert Muirhead arrived at Eileen Moor on December 29, 1900, carrying the weight of the Northern Lighthouse Board's reputation and the impossible task of explaining how three professional keepers had vanished without disturbing a single lamp or leaving behind a coherent clue. His investigation would become the template for maritime mystery analysis, but even his methodical approach couldn't silence the questions that echoed across the Hebrides. This wasn't just about three missing men. It was about whether the lighthouse system that protected thousands of ships annually could be trusted when nature unleashed its ultimate fury. Muirhead brought 40 years of lighthouse experience to Eileen Moor, having supervised installations from the Shetlands to the Irish Sea. He'd investigated equipment failures, personnel issues, and weather damage across Scotland's most challenging outposts. But nothing in his career had prepared him for the complete absence of evidence that greeted him on the Flannan Isles. The superintendent's team included marine engineers, weather specialists, and accident investigators, men trained to reconstruct maritime disasters from the smallest fragments of evidence. They spread across the lighthouse compound with the systematic precision of archaeologists, measuring, photographing, and cataloging every detail that might explain the impossible. Muirhead's preliminary examination confirmed Moore's initial observations. The lighthouse mechanism remained in perfect working order, its clockwork timing systems wound and ready for operation. The massive Fresnel lens showed no damage from the recent storms. Most tellingly, the light's fuel supply had been meticulously maintained, tanks filled, wicks trimmed, backup paraffin stored according to regulation. These men were preparing for a normal watch rotation, Muirhead noted in his preliminary report. Whatever interrupted their routine occurred suddenly, without warning, and before they could secure the station properly. The kitchen provided additional clues that deepened the mystery. Meals had been prepared and partially consumed, but the plates showed no signs of hurried abandonment. Chairs remained properly positioned around the table. Cooking utensils hung in their designated places. The scene suggested normal activity that had simply stopped. Muirhead's team conducted extensive interviews with the Hesperus crew, documenting every detail of their December 26th arrival. Captain Harvey's testimony proved particularly valuable, his experienced eye having noted several anomalies that landlubbers might have missed. The absence of the customary signal flag represented more than mere oversight. Lighthouse protocol demanded immediate acknowledgement of any approaching vessel, especially the scheduled relief boat. Keepers who failed to follow such procedures faced disciplinary action or dismissal. For three men to collectively ignore these fundamental requirements suggested either mass incapacitation or circumstances beyond their control. Weather analysis formed the cornerstone of Muirhead's investigation. The superintendent obtained detailed barometric readings from weather stations across the Hebrides, constructing a comprehensive picture of the storm that had battered the islands from December 15th through 17th. The data painted a terrifying portrait of natural violence. Sustained winds had reached force 9 intensity, severe gale conditions with velocities between 47 and 54 knots. Gusts had exceeded 70 miles per hour, strong enough to lift grown men off their feet and hurl them like leaves. Barometric pressure had plummeted to levels typically associated with major hurricanes. Most significantly, the storm's direction had driven its full fury against Eileen Moor's western exposure. The lighthouse sat directly in the path of waves that had traveled unobstructed across thousands of miles of open Atlantic, gathering energy and height with each passing hour. By the time they reached the Flannan Isles, these waves represented concentrated oceanic power capable of reshaping coastlines. Muirhead's engineering analysis of the West Landing destruction provided crucial insights into the storm's unprecedented violence. The superintendent calculated that moving the 1-ton boulder required wave action equivalent to approximately 50 tons of water striking the landing simultaneously. Such forces occurred perhaps once in a generation, even in the storm-battered Hebrides. The twisted railings told their own story of metallic failure under impossible stress. Muirhead ordered metallurgical analysis of the fracture points, confirming that the iron had been subjected to torsional forces far exceeding its design specifications. The railings hadn't simply bent. They had been literally twisted apart by rotating water masses of extraordinary power. But the most damning evidence lay in the timing correlation between the lighthouse failure and the storm's peak intensity. The Arch Tour's log entry documenting the light's absence occurred at precisely 10:47 p.m. on December 15th, exactly when weather records showed the gale reaching maximum fury. No coincidence could explain such perfect synchronization. Muirhead's final report, submitted to the Northern Lighthouse Board on January 8, 1901, presented conclusions that satisfied maritime law but left deeper questions unanswered. The superintendent determined that all 3 keepers had violated fundamental safety protocols by leaving the lighthouse unattended during severe weather conditions. The evidence suggests, Muirhead wrote, that the men observed damage to the West Landing and attempted to secure equipment during the height of the storm. They were subsequently swept completely away by an exceptional wave of unusual size and power. The official verdict carried the weight of professional analysis and decades of lighthouse experience. It explained the physical evidence, accounted for the timing, and provided closure for the families awaiting news of their loved ones. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about why 3 seasoned professionals would risk everything to secure equipment that could be replaced. Lighthouse keepers understood wave mechanics better than most sailors. They'd witnessed countless storms from their elevated perches, watching massive breakers explode against coastal rocks with forces that shattered stone and twisted steel. Why would such experienced men venture into conditions they knew were lethal? The search for bodies continued for 12 more days. Teams of volunteers combing every accessible beach and rocky outcrop within 50 miles of Eileen Moor. They found nothing, no clothing, no equipment, no trace that 3 human beings had ever existed on that remote island. Even the sea seemed determined to keep its secrets, offering up neither evidence nor explanation for the Flannan Isles tragedy. But could Muirhead's rational explanation account for every detail of the keeper's disappearance, or were there forces at work that 19th century maritime science couldn't comprehend? The official report satisfied maritime bureaucrats and insurance investigators, but it couldn't silence the whispers that began spreading through Highland fishing villages within weeks of Muirhead's conclusions. Whispers that suggested the Flannan Isles mystery contained layers of strangeness that no wave, however monstrous, could adequately explain. These weren't merely ghost stories told around tavern fires. They were systematic challenges to accepted maritime science that would transform 3 missing lighthouse keepers into Scotland's most enduring enigma. The first cracks in the official narrative appeared when local fishermen began sharing their own observations from mid-December 1900. Angus MacLeod, who had worked the waters around the Flannan Isles for 30 years, claimed he'd witnessed something extraordinary on the night of December 15th. From his boat sheltering in Loch Rog, MacLeod reported seeing lights moving across Eileen Moor. Not the steady beam of the lighthouse, but smaller, dancing illuminations that seemed to weave between the buildings. They moved like lanterns carried by walking men. MacLeod told anyone who would listen. But no keeper would venture outside in such weather, and the lights moved in patterns that made no earthly sense. Other fishermen corroborated similar sightings. Donald Morrison, captain of the fishing vessel Clan MacLeod, logged unusual light phenomena around the Flannan Isles during the crucial period. His crew reported seeing what appeared to be signal fires on the cliffs, brief, intense flashes that came and went like lighthouse beams, but from locations where no lighthouse existed. These testimonies gained credibility because they came from professional seamen who understood the difference between natural and artificial illumination. Fishermen spent their lives reading light patterns on water, distinguishing between moonbeams, phosphorescence, and human-made signals. Their unanimous insistence that something unnatural had occurred on Eilean Moor carried weight in communities where survival depended on accurate observation. The supernatural explanation found additional support in the island's dark history. Local historians reminded anyone willing to listen that the Flannan Isles had been considered cursed long before the lighthouse ever cast its first beam. Ancient Celtic legends spoke of the islands as a gateway between worlds, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin during winter storms. The name Seven Hunters itself carried ominous implications. According to Gaelic tradition, the islands represented 7 warriors who had been transformed into stone guardians, eternally watching over waters that had claimed countless lives. The lighthouse, some argued, had been built directly atop sacred ground, disturbing forces that predated human memory. Father Alan MacDonald, a Catholic priest who had ministered throughout the Hebrides for decades, offered a different perspective that nonetheless challenged the official explanation. MacDonald had interviewed lighthouse keepers across the islands and documented numerous accounts of unexplained phenomena, voices heard during calm weather, figures seen walking where no human should be, equipment that moved without explanation. These men live in isolation for months at a time, MacDonald explained to the Highland Religious Society. They develop sensitivities to spiritual presences that city dwellers never experience. The keepers who worked the Flannan Isles reported unusual experiences from the station's earliest days. The priest's records contained testimonies from previous lighthouse crews that painted a disturbing picture of the station's atmosphere. Keepers reported hearing footsteps in empty corridors, finding doors that had been securely locked, standing open, discovering tools and equipment moved to locations where no keeper had placed them. Most unsettling were the accounts of voices heard across the water during clear weather. Not the natural sounds of wind and waves, but distinctly human conversations that seemed to emanate from the sea itself. Multiple keepers had logged these incidents, describing conversations in what sounded like archaic Gaelic, as if ancient voices were somehow preserved in the island's stone and released during specific atmospheric conditions. Maritime investigators began re-examining the physical evidence with fresh eyes, looking for details that might support alternative explanations. The carved message Moore had discovered, "We have been taken," received particular scrutiny. Handwriting analysis suggested the carving had been made hurriedly, possibly in poor light, but the wood showed no signs of recent weathering that would indicate the message had been exposed to the elements for days. This timing discrepancy raised disturbing questions. If the keepers had vanished on December 15th during the storm's peak, when had they found time to carve their apparent final message? The fresh appearance of the cuts suggested they had been made after the weather cleared, implying the men had survived the initial disaster only to meet some other fate. Technical analysis of the lighthouse mechanism revealed additional anomalies that challenged the official timeline. The fuel consumption records didn't match the number of days the light should have burned. Someone, or something, had operated the beacon for at least 2 days after the keeper's supposed disappearance, maintaining the precise timing and fuel flow that required human intervention. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered that the lighthouse's fog signal had been activated repeatedly during the nights following December 15th. Ships' logs from vessels passing the Flannan Isles recorded hearing the distinctive horn pattern that keepers used to guide boats during heavy weather. But who had been operating the signal if all 3 men were dead? Dr. Alistair Macbeth, a professor of maritime engineering at Glasgow University, published a detailed analysis questioning whether any wave could have generated the destruction found at the West Landing. Macbeth's calculations suggested that the forces required to move the 1-ton boulder and twist the iron railings exceeded those possible during even the most severe North Atlantic storms. The damage pattern indicates rotational forces that no linear wave action can produce. Macbeth argued in the Scottish Maritime Journal, "We may be dealing with meteorological phenomena not yet understood by current science, or forces of an entirely different nature." The professor's academic credentials lent weight to theories that had previously been dismissed as folklore. If conventional wave mechanics couldn't explain the physical evidence, then perhaps the Flannan Isles mystery required unconventional solutions. But as alternative theories proliferated, they raised an even more troubling question. If 3 experienced lighthouse keepers hadn't been swept away by a rogue wave, then what had actually happened to them on that storm-lashed island? 12 years after the keepers vanished, a haunting ballad transformed 3 missing lighthouse men into immortal figures of Celtic folklore. But the poet's vivid imagination would corrupt the historical record so thoroughly that fact and fiction became impossible to separate, launching the Flannan Isles mystery into a realm where truth mattered less than the power of a prized, compelling story. This wasn't simply artistic license. It was the moment when a maritime tragedy became a cultural phenomenon that would outlive everyone who remembered the real events. Wilfred Wilson, Gibson's poem, Flannan Isle, published in 1912, painted an image that seared itself into the public consciousness with devastating effectiveness. Gibson described the relief keeper discovering an abandoned meal still warm on the table, an overturned chair suggesting sudden departure, and an atmosphere of supernatural dread that permeated the empty lighthouse. "We seemed to stand for an endless while, though still no word was said. 3 men alive on Flannan Isle, who thought on 3 men dead," Gibson wrote, his verses creating a scene that felt more authentic than the actual evidence. The poem's power lay not in its accuracy. Gibson had never visited the Flannan Isles and based his work entirely on newspaper accounts, but in its ability to crystallize the mystery's emotional core. Readers who encountered Gibson's version remembered the overturned chair, the abandoned meal, the sense of sudden interruption that suggested something far more sinister than accidental drowning. Within a decade, Gibson's fictional details had become accepted facts in popular retellings of the mystery. Tourist guides quoted the poem as historical documentation. Newspaper articles referenced the overturned chair as evidence of supernatural intervention. The actual investigation reports, with their careful documentation of cleaned lamps and unmade beds, were forgotten in favor of more dramatically satisfying imagery. This transformation reflected a deeper human need to find meaning in randomness, to impose narrative structure on events that defied rational explanation. The real Flannan Isles mystery offered no clear resolution, no satisfying conclusion that tied together all the loose ends. Gibson's version provided the emotional closure that the facts couldn't deliver. The legend's evolution accelerated when writers began publishing what they claimed were excerpts from the Lighthouse logbooks, detailed entries supposedly written by the keepers during their final days. These fabricated documents described mounting terror, supernatural encounters, and desperate prayers for salvation. One widely circulated logbook entry described Thomas Marshall writing, "The wind is howling, and the men are praying. God help us all." Another purported to quote James Ducat's final words, "The lights have returned, and they are not of this world." These dramatic passages appeared in books, magazines, and newspaper features for decades before researchers proved them to be complete fabrications. The fake logbook entries served a crucial narrative function that the authentic records couldn't provide. The real final entry, Ducat's prosaic notation about storm conditions and routine maintenance, offered no insight into the keeper's mental state or the circumstances of their disappearance. The fabricated versions filled that gap with supernatural drama that satisfied readers' desire for deeper meaning. But the mythologizing process did more than entertain. It actively obscured legitimate questions about the case that deserved serious investigation. As the legend grew more elaborate, researchers found it increasingly difficult to separate authentic evidence from literary embellishment. Witnesses began incorporating fictional elements into their own recollections, creating a feedback loop that contaminated the historical record. The Northern Lighthouse Board faced a peculiar challenge as the Flannan Isles story spread throughout popular culture. The organization's reputation depended on public confidence in lighthouse safety and keeper reliability. Supernatural explanations for the tragedy undermined that confidence more effectively than any mundane accident report. Board officials found themselves in the awkward position of defending rational explanations against increasingly elaborate alternative theories. When newspaper reporters asked about the growing folklore surrounding the case, lighthouse administrators could only repeat Muirhead's original conclusions while watching their carefully documented investigation disappear beneath layers of accumulated myth. The search for physical evidence continued sporadically for years after the official investigation closed. Beachcombers and amateur historians scoured the Hebridean coastline, hoping to discover some artifact that might illuminate the keeper's fate. Their efforts yielded nothing: no clothing, no tools, no personal effects that could be definitively linked to Ducat, Marshall, or McArthur. This complete absence of recoverable evidence became another cornerstone of the mystery's supernatural interpretation. In a region where Atlantic storms regularly deposited debris from shipwrecks hundreds of miles away, the total disappearance of 3 men's possessions seemed to defy natural explanation. Believers argued that conventional drowning would have produced at least some recoverable artifacts, making the clean vanishing evidence of otherworldly intervention. Maritime historians began comparing the Flannan Isles case to other mysterious disappearances in lighthouse history, searching for patterns that might explain the inexplicable. They found isolated incidents of individual keepers vanishing from remote stations, but nothing that approached the complete disappearance of an entire crew from a properly maintained facility. The Flannan Isles mystery stood alone in the Northern Lighthouse Board's century-long history as the only unresolved loss of lighthouse personnel. This singular status elevated the case beyond mere maritime tragedy into something approaching maritime mythology, a unique event that seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of accident investigation and risk assessment. Dr. James Morton, who compiled the definitive academic history of Scottish lighthouse operations, struggled to place the Flannan Isles incident within the broader context of maritime safety. "We have detailed records of every significant lighthouse accident from 1840 onwards," Morton noted in his 1963 study. "Equipment failures, structural collapses, personnel injuries, all properly documented and explained. The Flannan Isles case remains the single exception to our comprehensive understanding of lighthouse operations." As the 20th century progressed, the mystery attracted attention from investigators far removed from maritime affairs. Psychic researchers, UFO enthusiasts, and paranormal investigators all claimed the case as evidence supporting their particular theories about unexplained phenomena. But perhaps the most disturbing development was the gradual realization that the more people studied the Flannan Isles mystery, the less they seemed to understand about what had actually happened on that storm-battered island in December 1900. What happens when a historical mystery becomes so entangled with fiction that the truth becomes literally unknowable? Over a century after 3 keepers vanished into the Atlantic night, 21st century science promised to finally solve the Flannan Isles mystery using meteorological models, forensic techniques, and oceanographic data that Victorian investigators could never have imagined. But each new analysis only deepened the questions surrounding that December night in 1900. The tools of modern investigation have transformed our understanding of countless historical mysteries. Yet the Flannan Isles case continues to resist every attempt at definitive explanation. In 1999, marine meteorologist Dr. Sarah Caldwell of the Scottish Association for Marine Science undertook the most comprehensive weather analysis ever attempted for the Flannan Isles incident. Using satellite data, computer modeling, and century-old barometric readings, Caldwell reconstructed the December 15 storm with unprecedented precision. Her findings confirmed the extraordinary violence of the weather system that battered the Hebrides. Wind speeds had indeed reached hurricane force, with sustained velocities of 87 miles per hour and gusts exceeding 100. Wave heights in the deep Atlantic had reached 40 to 50 feet, with peak waves possibly exceeding 60 feet as they approached the shallow waters around Eilean Mor. But Caldwell's analysis also revealed troubling inconsistencies in the traditional explanation. Computer models of wave behavior around the Flannan Isles showed that the island's western cliffs should have provided some protection from the storm's full fury. The worst wave action should have occurred on the eastern and northern exposures, not the western landing where investigators found the most devastating damage. The destruction pattern doesn't match the meteorological evidence, Caldwell reported to the Royal Meteorological Society. The waves that caused this damage would have required wind patterns that our models cannot reproduce using the actual atmospheric conditions recorded for December 15 through 17, 1900. Modern oceanographic analysis raised additional questions about the official drowning theory. Dr. Marcus Webb, a specialist in North Atlantic current patterns, mapped the water movements around the Flannan Isles during winter storm conditions. His research revealed that bodies lost in the waters around Eilean Mor should have been recovered within days, carried by predictable current patterns to beaches across the Hebrides. The tidal patterns and current flows are well established, Webb explained in the Journal of Maritime Studies. Objects, including human remains that enter the water around the Flannan Isles, follow consistent drift patterns. The complete absence of any recoverable evidence suggests either the men never entered the water or they were removed from it by means we don't understand. Archaeological techniques previously unavailable to Victorian investigators provided new insights into the Lighthouse compound's final hours. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalous electromagnetic signatures beneath the west landing, suggesting the storm had displaced far more material than originally documented. Metal detection surveys uncovered fragments of iron and steel scattered across areas that should have been beyond the reach of any wave. Most intriguingly, modern forensic analysis of the lighthouse structure revealed stress patterns in the masonry that didn't match storm damage. Dr. Angela Foster, a structural engineer specializing in historical buildings, discovered microfractures in the tower's stone walls that suggested exposure to intense vibrations rather than wind pressure. The fracture patterns are consistent with seismic activity or extremely low-frequency sound waves, Foster noted in her 2007 report. These aren't the stress signatures we would expect from wind loading or wave impact. The discovery of vibrational damage opened new avenues of investigation that previous generations of researchers couldn't have pursued. Seismological data from the period proved frustratingly incomplete. Earthquake monitoring in 1900 was rudimentary compared to modern standards, but contemporary weather stations had recorded unusual barometric fluctuations during the crucial December period. Dr. Timothy Blackwood, a specialist in atmospheric anomalies, identified pressure variations that suggested the presence of what meteorologists now call atmospheric gravity waves, large-scale oscillations in air pressure that can generate effects similar to seismic activity. These phenomena, barely understood even today, could theoretically produce the low-frequency vibrations that damaged the lighthouse masonry. We're looking at atmospheric conditions that were extreme even by North Atlantic standards. Blackwood explained. The pressure gradients recorded during December 15 were off the charts, literally beyond the measurement capabilities of period instruments. Modern psychological analysis has also shed new light on the keepers' potential mental state during their final days. Dr. Rebecca Hamilton, who studies the effects of isolation on maritime personnel, noted that lighthouse keepers in 1900 faced psychological stresses that contemporary maritime workers rarely experience. Extended isolation, combined with the constant stress of maintaining life-saving equipment, created unique psychological pressures, Hamilton observed. Add severe weather conditions and possible supernatural beliefs, and you have a situation where rational decision-making could be severely compromised. But Hamilton's analysis raised as many questions as it answered. Lighthouse keepers were specifically selected for their psychological stability and resistance to isolation stress. The 3 men who vanished from Eilean Mor had all demonstrated their ability to handle extreme conditions during previous assignments. What could have pushed such experienced professionals beyond their breaking point? The most ambitious modern investigation began in 2015 when marine archaeologist Dr. Colin Morrison organized a comprehensive underwater survey of the waters around the Flannan Isles. Using side-scan sonar, remotely operated vehicles, and saturation diving techniques, Morrison's team mapped the seafloor with unprecedented detail. The survey revealed the remains of numerous shipwrecks dating back centuries, confirming the island's reputation as a maritime graveyard. But the team found no evidence of more recent additions to this underwater cemetery, no wreckage that could be linked to the missing keepers, no personal artifacts that might illuminate their fate. Morrison's negative findings proved as significant as any positive discovery. We've essentially eliminated the possibility that conventional drowning explains this case, Morrison concluded. If those men had been swept into the sea around Eilean Mor, we would have found some trace of their presence. DNA analysis techniques, developed in the 21st century, offered another investigative avenue that Victorian investigators couldn't access. Genetic material recovered from the lighthouse, compound hair follicles, skin cells, traces of saliva on drinking vessels could theoretically provide insights into the keeper's final hours. But when genetic researchers attempted to extract usable DNA from artifacts stored in the Northern Lighthouse Board's archives, they encountered an unexpected obstacle. The biological material had degraded far more extensively than preservation conditions should have allowed, as if exposed to some unknown destructive force. The cellular damage patterns are unlike anything we typically see in historical samples, reported Dr. Point. Lisa Chen, who specializes in ancient DNA extraction. It's as if the genetic material was subjected to intense electromagnetic radiation or some other energetic process we can't identify. Each new scientific analysis seemed to push the Flannan Isles mystery further beyond the reach of conventional explanation, suggesting that 21st century technology might be asking questions that no earthly science could answer. But what if the answer to the Flannan Isles mystery lies not in what happened to the 3 keepers, but in what they discovered about the true nature of their isolated outpost? On a cold December morning in 2023, exactly 123 years after 3 lighthouse keepers vanished into legend, marine biologist Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood on the same west landing where Joseph Moore had discovered impossible destruction, and realized that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, but to remind us of the vast unknowns that still lurk beyond the edges of human understanding. This realization matters because the Flannan Isles case represents more than a historical curiosity. It stands as proof that even in our hyper-connected, scientifically advanced world, there remain events that defy every attempt at rational explanation. Rodriguez had come to Eilean Mor as part of a climate change research project, studying how rising sea levels might affect Scotland's historic lighthouse network. But like every visitor to the Flannan Isles, she found herself drawn into the deeper mystery that had haunted these waters for over a century. The lighthouse still operated, now automated and controlled remotely from Edinburgh. Solar panels and satellite communication equipment had replaced the manual systems that Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur had maintained with such dedication. Modern technology had eliminated the need for human keepers on most Scottish lighthouses, making the 1900 tragedy seem like an artifact from a simpler, more dangerous age. But Rodriguez's research revealed that the mysteries hadn't disappeared with the advancement of technology. Her team's instruments detected electromagnetic anomalies around the island that defied conventional explanation, energy patterns that seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the Atlantic tides, as if the island itself was breathing in harmony with the ocean. We're measuring electromagnetic signatures that don't correspond to any known geological or atmospheric phenomena, Rodriguez reported to the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. There's something about the Flannan Isles that our current scientific models simply cannot account for. The electromagnetic readings correlated with reports from modern sailors who claimed to experience navigation equipment failures when passing near the islands. GPS systems developed glitches, compass readings became erratic, and radio communications suffered unexplained interference. These 21st century anomalies echoed the supernatural fears that had surrounded the islands for centuries. Dr. Rodriguez's work represented the latest chapter in humanity's ongoing struggle to understand the Flannan Isles mystery. Each generation of investigators had approached the case with the tools and assumptions of their era, confident that advancing knowledge would finally provide the definitive answer. Victorian maritime experts blamed freak waves. 20th century psychologists suggested mass hysteria. 21st century scientists invoked atmospheric anomalies and electromagnetic phenomena. Yet the mystery endured, seemingly immune to every analytical framework that human ingenuity could devise. The case had become a kind of scientific Rorschach test, revealing more about the investigators' assumptions than about the actual events of December 1900. Perhaps the most significant development in recent Flannan Isles research came from an unexpected source. In 2018, artificial intelligence researchers at the University of Edinburgh fed every available piece of evidence into advanced pattern recognition systems, hoping that machine learning might identify connections that human investigators had missed. The AI analysis produced results that surprised even the researchers who designed the experiment. Instead of converging on a single explanation, the algorithms generated multiple, equally probable scenarios, some involving known physical phenomena, others requiring assumptions about forces that current science couldn't verify. The AI essentially told us that the available evidence is insufficient to support any definitive conclusion, explained Dr. Say. James Park, who led the computational analysis. But more intriguingly, it identified data patterns that suggest we may be missing crucial categories of information entirely. The artificial intelligence had detected something that decades of human investigation had overlooked. The evidence pattern suggested the presence of phenomena that wouldn't be measurable using any scientific instruments available in 1900, or possibly even today. This finding aligned with a growing recognition among researchers that the Flannan Isles case might represent a limitation of investigative methodology rather than simply an unsolved mystery. Some events might be fundamentally unknowable, using conventional analytical approaches, existing in a realm where scientific materialism encounters its boundaries. Dr. Margaret Thompson, a philosopher of science who has studied unsolved mysteries across multiple disciplines, argued that cases like the Flannan Isles serve an important function in human knowledge development. These mysteries remind us that our understanding of reality remains incomplete, Thompson observed. They keep us humble in the face of forces we haven't yet learned to measure or comprehend. The Flannan Isles mystery has also evolved into a cultural touchstone that transcends its original maritime context. Writers, filmmakers, and artists continue to draw inspiration from the case, creating new interpretations that add layers of meaning to the original events. Each retelling serves both to preserve the mystery's memory and to distance it further from historical accuracy. Modern visitors to the Flannan Isles often report experiences that echo the supernatural elements of the original story. Tour groups describe sudden temperature drops, unexplained sounds, and electronic equipment malfunctions that have no apparent cause. Whether these phenomena represent genuine anomalies or psychological responses to the location's reputation remains an open question. The Northern Lighthouse Board maintains detailed records of every reported incident at the Flannan Isles, creating a contemporary database of unexplained events that spans decades. Officials note patterns in the reports. Certain weather conditions seem to trigger more anomalous experiences, and multiple independent witnesses often describe similar phenomena occurring simultaneously. "We can't explain what people are experiencing," admits current board supervisor Thomas McDonald, "but we can document it systematically and hope that future investigators might identify patterns we're missing." The mystery's endurance has transformed the Flannan Isles into something approaching a pilgrimage site for people fascinated by the unexplained. Marine archaeologists, paranormal investigators, amateur historians, and curious tourists all make the challenging journey to Eilean Moor, each hoping to discover the clue that previous visitors missed. But perhaps the real significance of the Flannan Isles mystery lies not in any future solution, but in its function as a permanent reminder of the limits of human knowledge. In an age when we can map genomes, detect gravitational waves, and photograph black holes, the complete disappearance of 3 lighthouse keepers continues to resist explanation. The case suggests that reality contains layers of complexity that our current scientific frameworks cannot penetrate. Whether those layers involve unknown physical phenomena, consciousness effects we don't understand, or forces that exist outside the boundaries of material science, remains an open question that may challenge investigators for generations to come. Standing on the Flannan Isles today, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across the same waters where 3 men vanished over a century ago, visitors encounter something increasingly rare in our modern world: genuine mystery that no amount of analysis can diminish. The light still shines, the waves still crash against the cliffs, and somewhere in the space between what we know and what we can never understand, the spirits of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur continue their eternal watch over one of the sea's most enduring secrets. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.